is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters, and he restores my soul. He leads me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for he is with me. His rod and his staff, they comfort me. He anoints my head with oil, and my cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Now, one of my favorite aspects of Psalm 23 is if you read verses 3 and then verses 4, you'll notice how he talks about he leads us in the path and his path of righteousness for his name's sake. And immediately after it talks about the path of righteousness he leads us in verse 4, it picks up in the valley of the shadow of death. And I find that really interesting because it kind of implies that the path of righteousness, like there's a guaranteed chance that the path of righteousness always takes a detour through the valley. And that's kind of interesting to me that the valley is like it seems to be an integral part of the path of righteousness. And I think that's because if you think about it, you know, the Apostle Paul talked about us dying to ourselves, dying to our flesh. And if you think about like the valley of the shadow of death, like what does death have to do with the path of righteousness, right? Well, like we're supposed to mortify the flesh. We're supposed to put to death the members of the body, right? The members of the flesh, right? And so I think like the dark times that we walk through, they are for our sanctification. They're part of our building the righteousness that we have in Christ, right? Because like we walk with Christ and we're conformed to his image. And the thing is like it's true that Christ is glorious and that he raised from the dead on the third day, but it's also true that he endured a terrible crucifixion. And so, you know, that the thing is the righteous path, this path of righteousness, it's intimately connected to the valley of the shadow of death. And that's why he says, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Right? The reason that he doesn't fear any evil is because God is with him. But also, I think it's knowing that this valley is just as important as these green pastures and these still waters that are mentioned in verses 2 and 3. The valley is just as much a part of the path of righteousness as the green pastures and the still waters. And everybody wants the green pastures and the still waters, but they don't want the valley. But he says, you lead me through the path of righteousness for your name's sake. And if you think about this as a valley, right, you're walking and there's these green pastures and there's still waters and there's these hills and there's these valleys. It's all part of the same path. You can't have part of the path and not the other part of the path. You know, does that make sense to everyone? You know. So yeah, that's one of the things I love about Psalm 23. Another thing I find really interesting about Psalm 23 is it says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and you anoint my head with oil, and my cup runs over." And this part always makes me think of the Last Supper, where Jesus holds up the cup and he holds up the bread, and he says the words of institution. You know, this is my body. You know, take and eat. You know, this is my blood. You know, shed for you. And if you think about it, if you read this here, it says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and you anoint my head with oil, and my cup runs over." I get this Last Supper image, you know, because you got to remember Judas was sitting at the table, right? And so, although I don't know if verse 5 is meant to be prophetic, it just always makes me think of the Last Supper. You know, does it make anyone else think of the Last Supper? Does anyone understand what I'm talking about with verse 5 and relating it to the Last Supper just before Jesus' crucifixion, where he talks about, you know, you prepare, you know, where he, says the words of institution with the bread and the wine. That's what I always think of when I hear this verse. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup runs over. And then it says, you know, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Right? And I love how in Psalm 23 it really does alternate between these really obvious verses about like the good life, right? You've got the green pastures and the still waters, but then you have the valley of the shadow of death. And then you've got, the table in the presence of the enemies, but you also have your head anointed with oil and your cup running over, right? And so you really get this vision of hills and valleys, right? Like you've got these high points and you've got these low points. And the shepherd leads us through all of them, right? He leads us through the hills and the valleys, right? Not just the hills and not just the valleys. Like he takes us through all of them. And the end result is we're all on our way to dwelling in the house of the Lord forever. This is where he's leading us, right? To dwell in his house forever. The reason we're passing through these green pastures, the reason we're passing through the still waters, the reason we're passing through the valley of the shadow of death is so that we can get to this point, to dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Right? That's where he's leading us. So, Psalm 23, it's really a psalm that's like a roadmap. You can think of it as like a roadmap. It's this map of where the shepherd wants to lead us. And he doesn't just want to lead us through the green pastures and in the still waters, but through the valley. And so if you're going through the valley, it's not an unplanned part of the path. Like it's as much of a part of the path of righteousness. It's as much as the part of the path of righteousness as the green pastures and the still waters. Right?